welcome back to this second hour of Liquid Lunch on Newsmax TV. I'm John Tobacco. You are watching a Women Wednesday edition where the first hour today we have only women on. And that does not mean we only have women on Wednesdays. That means we give the woman's perspective because it's most often probably better than men's. And what a whopper of a show we've had today. But to continue that, I want to thank Simon Constable for joining us from the UK, talking to us about Brexit and all the stuff going on in Germany. And when we bring it back to our shores for this second hour, joining us today by Skype is former Republican Congressman Bob Barr from Georgia. He was a U.S. attorney. He was also a libertarian candidate for president. And Congressman Barr, thanks for joining us today on Liquid Lunch. Appreciate it.
Listen, it's always good to be with you and your listeners and viewers. Very important topics these days.
Absolutely. And one of the things that everyone wants to talk about these days, except it seems Mitch McConnell, is reforms to our gun laws. And we have a big libertarian audience here at Newsmax. Frankie and I, we're both supporters of the Second Amendment and not infringing on the people's right to bear arms. But is there some common ground the Republicans and Democrats can find? 90% of Americans want some change.
It's very difficult to find common ground, but there are some specific areas. In the climate today, of course, and this is generally the case for gun control advocates, they look for a simple solution, whether it's outlawing this particular type of gun or outlawing this particular type of transaction or putting in place this particular database. It's not that simple. We're facing a very deep cultural problem in this country that I believe is giving rise to these violent, particularly young men. But that aside, yes, there are some specific things that can be done, but one has to be very, very careful not to trample on not just the Second Amendment, but the Fourth Amendment, which protects us from unreasonable searches and seizures, the 14th Amendment, which protects us against improper government action without affording due process or equal protection, and winding through that minefield of constitutional protections is very difficult. One area, for example, though, that I think we should look at, both particularly the federal government, is the databases that comprise the National Instant Check System. There are, I think, some specific things that Congress can do to provide better funding for that program. I think there are some adjustments that can be made so that information that schools, whether it's high schools or universities, receive or have that indicates a potential problem with a student or somebody, which is now protected against disclosing it to the FBI, for example, for the instant check. That certainly should be looked at and could be very helpful.
Congressman, this is Frank. Thanks so much for coming on television with us. There's very few people in the whole country, given your work as a U.S. attorney, as a congressman, as a thought leader in policy for many years, and as a CIA analyst, that are more well-versed in this issue than you've been over the years. You have written a very interesting proposal for the follow-up speech that President Trump needs to give. In your view, in the aftermath of these mass shootings, what should President Trump say next?
I think President Trump should sit in the Oval Office, the President of the United States, and deliver a primetime message to the American people that lays out once and for all, very explicitly, that extremism, whether on the right or the left, but particularly on the right, since that is the president's party, the conservative voters and the GOP, that has no place whatsoever in our political discourse or political activity in our country. For far too long, I think a lot of folks in the Republican Party have sort of not ignored the problem of white nationalists sort of gaining cover or hiding behind the facade of being conservatives or Republican, maybe in the hopes that it would go away. It obviously won't go away. It is a problem. And I think the president ought to use his office as leader of both the Republican Party and the political apparatus of our country as president to make that statement very clearly. That is not to say at all, as I wrote just today, that the Democrats don't have an equal responsibility on their part to take to the airwaves, tone down their rhetoric, and make very clear that the Democratic Party will not allow these Antifa and other violent-prone individuals on the left hide behind the facade of their party or liberal ideas. Both the Republicans and the Democrats need to do this, but I think the president, as the president, should take the lead.
Congressman, in a lengthy career of saying controversial things, I think that statement that everybody should condemn the lunatics on both sides and the extremists on both sides might be your least controversial statement yet. But I do want to ask your view as to why there are so many mass shootings in the United States. We've heard a lot about mental illness. We've heard a lot about violent video games. But advocates of stricter gun laws always point to the fact that America just has more weapons and more assault weapons than any other country in the world. In your view, what do you say to that argument, that correlation, and why do you think there are so many mass shootings here?
Certainly, we do have in this country explicit recognition that a fundamental human right is the right to protect oneself, and that is with a firearm. Our founding fathers incorporated that right as against government taking it away or undercutting it in the Second Amendment. Other countries don't have that. That makes it very, very different in this country to deal with the problem of firearms. And it also obviously accounts for the fact that we do have per capita many firearms in this country. That is part of the freedom of being an American, a recognition that that is a fundamental human right that the government cannot take away. Beyond that, though, I think we see in the United States a cultural problem that is not unique to America. We see the same thing in Western Europe, and we see it certainly in the Middle East. There was a very interesting opinion piece, I think, perhaps just today in the Wall Street Journal, by a former intelligence analyst, I think, similar to my background. And he focused on the rise of extreme violence as a characteristic of young men in the Middle Eastern countries. And he traces it back to the post-World War II era, where the sort of old monarchies, the old familiar patriarchal structure broke down, was not replaced by any mechanism for families and father figures in both in the homes of these young people and in the government generally. And that has given rise to sort of two generations now of lost young men without the real leadership and anchor of having father figures either at the family level or at the government level. And it provides a very, very right plowing field for these violent extremists with political agendas. That is something that we see both here in Western Europe and in the Middle East. And it needs to be addressed as a deep-seated cultural problem.
Got it. Well, Congressman Barr, I want to thank you so much for joining us today on Liquid Lunch. Your insights are welcome. And I agree with Congressman Barr. I wish we'd hear something from the left other than Chuck E. Cheese Schumer telling us how Donald Trump should take $5 billion from the wall to put it into gun control, which is not a real logical solution. Bob Barr, not to be confused with Bill Barr, thank you again for joining us. Thank you for watching Liquid Lunch. We're in the home stretch of hour 2. And coming up next, she's back again to wow and amaze our audiences. Dr. Judith Kuryansky joins us next.